There we go. It should be recording. So, and remind me if I don't. I want to end this as soon as I've finished presenting because this is just for the talk piece. So I've done something I don't normally do, or haven't done recently, which is prepare a lot of notes because this is a for me this is a difficult talk. We have on the front page of the website, many of you have noticed, there's a little box on the lower right-hand side which gives who's going to talk and what the subject's going to be, so you kind of know what you're letting yourself in for if you come on a Sunday. But I was just doing my emails yesterday morning, and I saw something that I could not respond to. And it was an article about 4 police officers in Memphis being fired, and a department or a task force in Memphis being terminated, and those 4 officers being about to be prosecuted for second-degree murder. And the cause of all of this was something that happened over 2 weeks ago, and I had missed it 2 weeks ago, which says something itself about our country. I don't see a lot of news, but that didn't come forward. It was a man by the name of Tyre Nichols who was beaten to death by the police in Memphis. It's just my heart breaks. It's just unbelievable. Can you imagine being beaten to death? Can you imagine inhabiting the sack of skin and bones that beats somebody to death, both while it's happening and then after it's happened? This is unimaginable to me, the suffering. So I want to talk about this today, but I want to talk about it from the standpoint of to try and bring it back to our practice. At one level, we read our practice as being, okay, let's end suffering and let's all become enlightened beings. But that happens here. That happens in this world where this kind of stuff is happening. So if our practice doesn't just equip us to live in this, but also give us the tools to be truly useful and help others in this, it's not really worth much. So I want to come at this from this standpoint. So, as I said, those 2 sides of this, it's just unimaginable to me. Being a black parent in this country, raising a young male, and having to think of this situation, which is kind of an everyday situation these days, your own fear, and what you have to tell this young man. I can't imagine this. And the suffering that's implicit in our society that leads to this, right? So, not reading a lot of news, not reading very much news at all, I looked up a couple of things and learned that in 2023, year to date, I saw a little headline that said 2023, year to date, America, 39 mass shootings. A mass shooting is a shooting in which 4 people are hit. 39. So this was yesterday, and I was thinking, a little later in the day, I went back and said, it's 44. So that article was about 3 days old. It's 44, including 2 yesterday. One of them was in LA. There's 3 people dead, 2 men and a woman in a car, and 4 people who are injured, and 2 of them are critically injured. A lot less traumatic, but I think equally important. Last year, there were 380 strikes in this country involving over 200,000 workers. 200,000 workers doesn't sound a lot of people in the grand scheme of the US. But when you think of the efforts that have gone on to suppress union activity, so the emotion and what happens when people do try and unionize, the level of dissatisfaction and suffering within a workforce for them to move into that space must be just enormous. And just for grins, companies where that happened and there was some success last year included Starbucks and Amazon. So this is to move beyond, this is not to trivialize any of the incidents, and particularly the immediate suffering of Tyre Nichols and his family and his community. But this is to broaden it and say, look, we're in a country which is just so full of suffering right now. There's so much here. Yes, guns are a problem. Absolutely. But you've still got somebody who has some emotion that's coming out with the gun. It's not, the guns are certainly a problem. These numbers and a lot of the issues would go down without them. But there is a fundamental problem regardless. We've got, and it doesn't stop there. We've got global warming, and then you look outside our country. Thoughts immediately go to the Ukraine. And then Ethiopia and Eritrea, Syria, Turkey, Mali, Somalia. The civil wars going on in this world, I mean, you could keep going. In some of these, 1 million people have died, and many of these hundreds of thousands have died. So we think this is a specific US problem. It's not. We got problems around the whole world, and just enormous suffering, not just as a result of these actions, but that leads people into those actions. What's going on that causes people to do this? And then, and it's not just today. I happen to have been reading a lot of watching and reading Shakespeare and reading about Shakespeare, which is Elizabethan England, Elizabethan and Jacobean England, back at the turn of the 16th century, so 400 years ago. And at that time, I mean, it's kind of shocking the extent to which the UK, and presumably therefore the whole of Europe, was very much business economy. There's an economy, there's money changing hands a lot, it's highly legalistic. But you're coming out of a period where you've just got constant battles where somebody says, I want to be king, and they get all of the men who are in the land of which they are the lord, and those men basically get up their pitchforks and go fight for the king, and half of them die. And it's just going on. And then it was at least a daily occurrence for somebody to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. And that, I won't go through it, but that is grotesque. Look it up. It's grotesque. And so when Shakespeare, the first time Shakespeare arrived in London, he went over London Bridge, and there were all these stakes sticking up out of the bridge with all these heads for people who had been beheaded, who were traitors or some malfeasance, and they were there to warn others off. And one of them was a young person who he knew personally from his village, from Stratford. It's just like everyday stuff. We were also at that time, a couple of hundred years before, the Jewish population had been kicked out. So there was a lot of pejorative language about Jews. Similarly, there was almost no population of color, period, but specifically African population. And so when Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice and Othello, those were really strong political statements, including these populations in the conversation, because there was a lot of unrest about the African population of the UK growing at that time. So the point of this is that's just one little vignette, one slice of time. You go anywhere in the world at any time. This is the world we live in. It's just full of suffering. It's just full of suffering. So where I'm going to go next is that we cannot separate ourselves from that suffering. So all of this suffering is transient, and it's all to do with everything being interconnected, right? And where we go with that interconnection is, I can't separate myself from any of this. I'm a direct lineal descendant of all of that stuff in Elizabethan England. How many people buy something from Amazon, right? I mean, if we buy from Amazon, we're supporting the system that causes the level of discontent in a workforce that leads that workforce to want to unionize. Starbucks, right? I don't go there often, but I do occasionally buy something from Starbucks. How many of us, particularly those with kids, will go down that garbage aisle at Walmart the last week in October and buy one of those horrible plastic costumes for your kids to wear, and one of those little orange pumpkin things that are just single use? They go in the trash. They're made in sweatshops in somewhere in Asia, with no idea where. And this is we're all involved in this, folks. How many of us? I was there. So how many of us have livelihoods where we look around the office and we want the promotion because we don't want to work for that person. We want those people to work for us. We want the pay increase because we want our little piece more of that scarce pie of scarce resources. I'll read you something here from Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde. If we are to keep the enormity of the forces aligned against us from establishing a false hierarchy of oppression, we must school ourselves to recognize that any attack against blacks, any attack against women, is an attack against all of us who recognize that our interests are not being served by the interests we support, or by the systems we support. I'll read that last bit again. All of us who recognize that our interests are not being served by the systems we support. That's language pointing at kind of a depersonalized way of looking at this, but we are inhabiting a world of systems, and there are systems that cause suffering. She, James Baldwin, and others make the point that it's not just the obvious victims of those systems who suffer, it's the oppressors who suffer. It's the people who are at the top of those hierarchies. A particular example that strikes home for me is years ago now, I saw a couple of little vignettes in an interview with somebody who worked in what I'll call a pig factory in the eastern, North Carolina, or I think it was North Carolina. But I mean, pigs are kept in utterly appalling conditions. Just appalling conditions. And to work in that environment is utterly dehumanizing for the individuals working in that environment, because there's no way of surviving in that environment unless you sacrifice your humanity when you walk in the door. So this is a man with children, a married man with children. And I have to tell you this, he was walking around, he had a steel rod, like a 3-foot, 4-foot steel rod. And he talked fairly candidly about the things he did to the pigs with that rod. That was fairly graphic and extremely unpleasant. So it's the oppressor, or the person who feels they're the beneficiary of this system, is also suffering enormously. They're dehumanized. So we can't separate ourselves from this. We are all part of this. The US system, the world system, and particularly the US system, are systems that are full of these little subsystems. The whole idea of a capitalist economy, it's about profit. Profit requires some kind of segregation of humanity where there's people who do better and people who don't. People are regarded as inferiors and people are regarded as superiors. It's implicit in the system that we live in and that we support. So how does we as practitioners deal with this? Because it can be completely overwhelming. And I've taken us down the path of saying it's not just this, it's this and this and this and this as well. So it can become completely overwhelming. Well, one place our practice takes us is, and it's an important place, is recognizing that ultimately this sack of skin and bones that I call Gareth is just a story. It's a story that's made up of all that I've just talked about. What inhabits this physical space right here, in a sense, is simply what's left over when everything else is described. When we've defined everything else, this is just what's left. So part of what we see in our practice is the impermanence and insubstantiality of this very thing that I call myself, of this very thing that is the locus of this suffering that I experience. The flip of it is that in our practice, we also see that this sack of skin and bones, in virtue of it not existing at all and being everything else, actually, I am everything. I am the whole universe. When I die, my universe dies with me. I am everything. And that's true for every one of you. Every one of you is everything. Jesus said, whatever thou doest unto the least of them, thou doest unto me. That's an actual experience. That's not just him telling stories for sympathy. So our practice moves us into this profound interconnection. And out of that, the way we move with the suffering shifts, right? So that's a growing realization as we practice. But let's go back to the mechanics. So what do we do? Well, I won't, and I can't tell you what to do. Each of us has to figure that out for ourselves. But what I can do, and I will do, is give you some thoughts that I hope will be helpful. And they come in two categories, really. One is some tools, and the other is kind of frameworks. So the tools, tool one is breathe. Just breathe. Remember that you are breathing. When you get triggered or caught, just remember that you're breathing and notice that and be with your breath. Just be with your breath. That's a grounding thing. Thing two is come back to your body. Now, there's a lot of stuff talked about coming back to the body, which I find can be unhelpful, but what you can do with your body is your body is really smart. We just don't listen to our body very much or very well. Our body is constantly talking to us, and our body is a gate or a door to the Dharma. So when I saw that article yesterday that was just overwhelming, and which is why I'm talking about this today, at my chest, it was a crushing feeling in my chest, just crushing. And just being with that and noticing that and allowing that to be, not getting caught up in the stories, but just allowing yourself to be with that sensation. Suffering happens, and it's a physical thing, just letting ourselves be with that, holding it gently. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about cradling his anger. He'd talk about this kind of suffering in exactly the same way. Find the suffering and hold it and care for it. And that's the suffering we find in here. Because until we can do that, we're not in a position to respond in a helpful way. And from that, allow yourself to grieve, because part of this physicality is feeling that grief, that anger. Allow these emotions. Don't suppress, don't just respond to them, but allow them to be and be with them. Because they need caring. They need you to be with them. Community. That's hopefully one of the things, for me, that's one of the things we're building here, and hopefully for the rest of you, that's one of the things we are building here, is a supportive community where we can feel safe. This is the eye of the storm. We can come here and we can feel safe. We can be with our fellow Sangha members and be safe. We can talk about this if we want. We don't have to talk about it. We could just hug each other and be there for each other. We can just be safe in community. And I'm pretty confident each of you, to varying degrees, has built community or is a member of community elsewhere. Community is a wonderful support. So these are tactics and methods, if you will, for grounding. And then we do something with all of this. We go out into the world in some way. Yes, there's nothing here, but the flip of it is this is everything, right? So what we do actually does matter. It can matter profoundly. There's the old story of the butterfly flapping its wings in China and causing a hurricane in the southeastern US, right? What we do actually matters. How we live our life matters. So things to do are, before acting on anything, slow down. Just slow down. Take an extra breath before you do anything. When we act, you can look at it as either planting a seed or watering a seed. The world's full of these little seeds. We're full of these little seeds, and we either water them or we plant them, however you want to use the metaphor. But we can be selective about which ones we choose to nurture. And we can choose to nurture the ones that are loving and caring and healthy, and that will be helpful for us and for the world. Or we can choose or not choose to cultivate and nurture the ones that are not healthy, the ones that are just unthoughtful anger. And those are going to be harmful and destructive both for us and for the world. They'll exacerbate problems, and they'll cause cycling and growing bad habit patterns in here that just get worse and worse. So being really intentional about which seeds we water, think about what we're doing and why, being aware of it. So just slowing down. I'll give you a silly little story. So many, many years ago, I'd been practicing for 2 or 3 years probably. So, I was like this superstar who was almost enlightened, and it's going to be like tomorrow when I woke up. And I took my kids to the little neighborhood park. There was somebody at the park with a radio, one of these boombox things, and it was blasting some kind of music out. And I thought, that's not really bothering me at all. It's not bothering me. I'm perfectly fine with that. But there are other people here, and it's probably destructive for their time with their kids, right? I mean, it's just me. And so I went, and in what I thought was a very pleasant way, suggested to him that this might be intruding. And he, of course, he told me where to go. Not skillful. It's incredibly easy to do with the best will in the world. I hadn't really slowed down. The point of that is simply, it's so easy to do that, even with the best will. So really slowing down, really being grounded, and being really thoughtful about which seeds we water. And then this is language Ben Conley uses a lot, and I've come to really like the language. Ben Conley is a Zen teacher who has come and led a couple of retreats here. And that's dismantling systems that cause suffering. There are big systems out there. We've talked about some of them. Capitalism, racism, the patriarchy, these are all big words for big systems, right? But these are things where I'm not going to be able to go dismantle those tomorrow. But I can recognize those systems, and I can recognize my participation in those systems, and I can intentionally decide to reduce my participation in those systems. So I don't have to be on Facebook engaged in one of these flame wars on Facebook. That's a really negative system that's causing a lot of harm. I'm sure there are good things that people do on Facebook, but I've just decided, it just happened, and now I'm going to continue to support that. I've not been in Facebook in a long time because I've found this toxic side of it, just unhealthy. So we can find systems that we can just reduce our participation in or withdraw from. And that's for ourselves, and it's for an example for others, and it's the participation of others in those systems as well. I mean, there's a critical mass thing here that goes on. And we bump into places where those systems cause oppression, that's a suffering that's visible to us. So if you're in a grocery store and somebody is being rude or offensive to a Muslim, an African American, a woman, somebody who's not, or somebody who's LGBTQ, somebody who's not just like this comfortably well-off, straight white, overeducated male, then are you okay just leaving that, or should you step forward and at least do something to support the person who's suffering? That's a decision for each of us to make. I'm not telling you what to do, but we encounter these systems, and what we can do is be skillful in how we deal with those. It's first notice the systems and then be skillful in how we deal with them, with a view to reducing our participation and generally just bringing those systems down. There's what I think is an important point that I skipped over that I meant to bring up earlier, which is none of us is going to save the world. We just can't, and it's not our job to. I came across something I think it's a fairly general teaching, but I first encountered this from Sayadaw U Pandita, who's one of those really wise Thai forest guys, teacher of Goldstein and Cornfield and that crowd. And he was talking about the Brahma Viharas. And the Brahma Viharas are those practices of loving kindness and compassion and so forth. And what he said was, so imagine a mother with 4 kids. She's got a small baby. She's cradling the baby and nursing it. And she wants that baby to grow up healthy and strong and successful. That's loving kindness. She's got a 3-year-old child who's sick, lying in bed, and she wants that child to get well. She's trying to help that child get well. That's compassion. She's got a teenage child who's doing well, passing exams, dating, having fun, growing up, really, really enjoying herself, and sympathetic joy. She shares in that child's joy with that child. The 4th, or the first child, is the oldest, who's married, has kids, has a stable livelihood, basically happy and settled. Sure, there are bumps, but that child is more than capable of dealing with those bumps. Doesn't need the mother, doesn't want the mother or father to help. Not in that kind of way. So the relationship there is one of equanimity. This planet is 4.5 billion years old. There has been life on this planet for 3.8 billion years. In something like another billion years, the conditions on the surface of this planet, because of the expanding sun and basically the heating of this orbital slot, in another billion years, this planet will be pretty much uninhabitable. So this planet, on a time scale that's got a life, it's alive for 4.5 billion years total. And in relative terms, it's in late middle age. It doesn't need us or want us to try and fix it. It's quite happy, thank you very much. Doesn't exonerate us from responsibility to move in a loving and a caring way, but it does tell us that it is not our place to think we own fixing it. So humility here is a really important piece of this. We've got to find our place in this and be comfortable with that place. And then we move in the way I've just described. Or not, we move with the kind of frameworks that I've just described. And the last framework is to love just incredibly generously. The Buddha said, Dr. King said, I think Mandela probably said, I think he said this too, but words to the effect that hate cannot end hate. Only love can end hate. So if we slow down, we think about the seeds we're sowing, and we always act out of a place of love, I think we use our community, I think we'll be okay. Thank you. I'm going to push the button.